Hi, everyone. Thank you all so much for being here. We're going to get started in about a minute. We'll just let some more people filter in. But my name is Nora Benavides. I'm here with my colleague, Hannah Waltz, and we will get started shortly. Okay. Well, good evening and good afternoon, good morning. Thank you all so much for being here, wherever you're coming from. My name is Nora Benavides. I work at PEN America. I run our media literacy and our disinformation work, and I am here with my wonderful colleague, Hannah Waltz. Hannah, wonderful. Hi, Hannah. Hannah and I will be co-leading this session together. And she is one of our wonderful colleagues in our media literacy program, coordinating everything. I wanted to get us started first with a screen share. So if you'll give me just a second, we're thrilled to be here, and we wanted to kick off our Fighting Election Disinformation event with a little bit of a background and the roadmap to what you all can expect today. I first want to give a really tremendous shout out to our partners, the New Georgia Project and Voto Latino. We are so thrilled to be working with them. We're going to be talking a little bit about their work today as well. But let's get started with a roadmap. We have about 90 minutes together, and what we hope to cover is, some of our background on how we came to work on disinformation, how we came to work on media literacy. And then we're going to talk about what we say is disinfo, misinfo, what's the difference, how disinformation works, why we are susceptible to it, and then what it would mean to respond, what it would mean if we were trying to think of solutions and ways to fight back using media literacy. And then finally, we're going to have a discussion and hopefully time for Q&A. So throughout all of this, we are peppering in examples around issues relevant to young, new, college, and first-time voters. Our hope is that this election season is one that is mobilizing interest, mobilizing conversation around these topics. And as we do that, we are working with partners like Voto Latino, New Georgia Project, and others to monitor the kinds of disinformation trends we are seeing and try to then work with communities that might be vulnerable to attacks. And college, young, new voters in the 18 to 24-year-old range are often one of those groups that are targeted and really vulnerable to believing various kinds of misleading tactics and messaging. And so we really want to just do as much as we can in the lead up to the election to work with all of you and to hear about what you're seeing online. So I think it's good to kick us off with a little bit of a backdrop to how PEN America got into this work. We have been an organization since our founding in the 1920s that, we were founded by writers for writers, was sort of what our founders said. And the notion was that writers needed to come together after World War I to try to defend the written word, to defend the notion that words matter. and that the way we use words is very important. That words can, on the one hand, be powerful tools to speak truth to power, and they can also then be used as vehicles to manipulate perceptions, attitudes, behaviors, and often can be used to further political gains. And so starting in 2016, we began examining what the effect of disinformation was. The idea that words could be manipulated, that narratives could be created to sow discord in our society. And we have always felt that words are important, but with the advent of the digital age, we have begun to see this proliferation and a rapid rise in how far disinformation can go, and that it can reach people in new and relatively innocuous ways that others are unaware of because of our own social practices. And so we've examined this phenomenon. We first called it in 2017 with our first report, Fraudulent News. And then we began re-examining what disinformation means, what misleading narratives actually look like. And here are just a few of the kinds of findings that we have seen. We've looked at really what the effect of disinformation is on our election cycles here in the United States. And one thing is, we absolutely have seen foreign interference. The US Senate has confirmed that. We have seen numerous articles, investigations, examples of foreign actors that infiltrate our social media feeds to incite and to do other things. But part of what we have found is that foreign interference has not exclusively been used to influence our electoral process. That actually, part of what foreign interference has done, whether it is Russian, Chinese, Iranian, is actually do something, I think, frankly, more insidious, really to sow polarization and discord, to undermine the very fabric of how we all believe in shared truths. And it's sort of a recurring theme of PEN America's that we have seen this disturbing unraveling of the fabric of our democracy because people simply cannot come together discussing shared truths, shared factual pieces of information. We've also then seen, of course, domestic actors here in the United States. These are homegrown tactics to push out conspiracy theories, radicalizing rhetoric, a range of ways that, frankly, domestic disinformation campaigns at first kind of mimicked foreign interference and have now taken on their own shape and contours. We've also then seen micro-targeting. And, I actually think that the micro-targeting of individuals or groups of people with political ads is one of the most dangerous aspects of our social media lives. That each of us may have tailored messaging given to us for a number of reasons based on our attitudes, our likes, our dislikes, the kinds of things that we actually like on Facebook and are drawn to. And when we each, let's say, have the opportunity to see something that differs from what another does, let's say Hannah and I each are given different messaging in our own ads on Facebook. If we come together and try to talk about that very issue, we'll be dealing with an entirely different set of facts or sets of information. And so we each then might be drawn to certain types of news, things that confirm our own opinions. And so when we come together, it's incredibly hard. And then finally, I would say that, this is all currently, this workshop and so much of what we're doing over the next month at PEN America is really trying to make that moment in which you see something and you react intensely, emotionally, whatever it is, we want to make you think twice, to pause and to take a breath. And a lot of that can happen on election day because so much of what we've seen in 2016 and 2018 have been these examples of incendiary headlines, videos or images taken out of context that really do contribute to voter depression. And we don't want this to become a new normal. In fact, I would say, despite our concerns, it already is a new normal. And the way that we think about solutions at PEN America is rather nuanced, because I don't think that we can necessarily abdicate all control to the platforms, that necessarily Facebook or Twitter or other platforms will solve everything. There have been some efforts to moderate content, though admittedly, a lot of the solutions from the platforms have slightly unintended and uneven consequences. And so one of our core findings from as early as 2017 was really to think about how can we empower citizens? How can we empower everyday people like you and me to make sense of what we are seeing? And so that was really the inspiration for our Knowing the News program, which launched in early 2020. We frankly thought we were dealing with a different world back then, and we imagined that we would be traveling, Hannah and I and the rest of our team, all over the country doing these kinds of sessions in the lead up to the 2020 election on the ground, that we would be in communities and we would go into libraries and we would work with community organizers. And then COVID hit, of course. And we have tried to adapt some of our programming, of course, for the virtual age. And we've thought about, you know, given the heightened civil unrest this summer, the way that we've seen disinformation pervade our scientific and our health research and our news around public health and safety, the way we have seen disinformation infiltrate around protests and civic engagement, we've really tried to bundle all of these things to try to help voters make sense of what we can anticipate this November. So I'll give you just a very, very short and condensed version of what we're actually doing. I have to say, I think it's exciting work. Just yesterday, we launched the public-facing campaign elements of all of our work around election defense. But of course, our Knowing the News program predates so much of just election-specific work. So of course, we're working with voters. We are trying to inoculate people like all of you attending this. We're working now, having trained over 11,000 voters around the country on how to identify disinformation. And then how to use media literacy skills to hopefully be part of the stopgap to prevent its spread. We're also then working with journalists and editors about what I think are the tough calls this election season. The questions around what headlines will they run? How are they going to think about when they cover what kinds of election results, from the local all the way up to the federal and the presidential election? And then we're working with influencers, with community leaders, with librarians, to try to give all of those sectors tools in these workshops to lead their own sessions, to adapt whatever it is, and to be able to embed some of this messaging. And so, you know, we're really excited about being here this evening with you. Part of what we're hoping to be able to do is just give you an opportunity to ask questions, to think about what's at stake this election season, and then, you know, why disinformation is such a potent threat. So I want to turn it over to my colleague, Hannah Waltz, who will be able to sort of kick us off and really dive into the meat of what we're talking about when we talk about disinformation.
Thank you, Nora. Hi, everyone. Just quickly, as Nora mentioned, I am the Media Literacy Training Coordinator, so I work very closely with Nora on this work. So we're just going to hop right into kind of the nitty-gritty of some of our media literacy strategies, trainings, and, you know, a lot of what that means is understanding how we are receiving the news, how we're digesting it, where we're getting it from. So without further ado, what you're seeing here on this first slide just kind of is a broad overview, you know, of a Pew Research study of studying how adults got their news from different gateways. So, you know, more and more these days, we are just glued to our screens. And even before many of us were sitting at home and online, Americans were just overwhelmed by this constant flow of news feeds and alerts. You know, since the beginning of the pandemic, we've seen internet usage go up almost 20%, and our social media consumption since the beginning has gone up nearly 50%. So, you know, these are just numbers, but really let those sink in and think about what that means. This increase is, you know, continuing to trend the same in the weeks leading up to the election as voters continue to seek this accurate information. So as I mentioned, this Pew Research Center, or this report is out of the Pew Research Center that was taken last year on the report. And we're seeing now that according to Pew, more than half of adult Americans, 55%, now get their news from social media. And if you want to look at, if you look at these graphs in a little more detail here, you can really see that Facebook and Twitter are really some of the most prevalent gateways for us to get that news. But it's important to keep that gateway aspect in mind. So it's often not the original source. We're going to take a look at some of the following ways that information comes to us, online or not, and just while we go through these, take kind of a private poll in your head, maybe even
Hannah, we lost your audio.
So think about that as you sought out information. I know I've seen just so much popping up on Instagram, on Facebook, options to look into ways to register to vote, etc. So, but just again, reiterating, keep in mind where that information is coming from, if it's coming through the social media platforms or directly from news sources themselves. Okay, so in the same way that these outlets serve as sources of truth and accurate information, they also have the potential to lead users, of course, to mis or disinformation. And we're going to kind of parse out the differences between these two terms. So what you see on this slide is the definition of disinformation. So demonstrably false information created with the intent to deceive. So this differs from the other term that I mentioned, misinformation, in the sense that misinformation, on the other hand, may be content that is simply shared as disinformation first, but then it never had the intent. So it was shared mistakenly or without the intent to deceive. Maybe you were just sharing with friends something that you thought might be helpful, but it was actually disinformation. So we're going to talk a little bit more about how those two terms continue to relate to each other and how we can combat that spread. So again, misinformation is spread in error. Disinformation is created with the intent to deceive. So we're going to talk a little bit more about how this shows up in our feeds and in our daily lives. Now, of course, here is a totally non-exhaustive list of the many faces of mis and disinformation, but these are some common types to keep a lookout for, especially in the next few weeks. And then later on, we'll discuss more about how these types are showing up in the context specifically of election disinformation. So this first one is something that we've been seeing on the rise in the past couple of years, and especially in the past couple months. We call them pink slime sites. So these are set up to mimic real news sites, but they're actually oftentimes politically backed and are made to look like local news websites and designed to promote either partisan talking points or collect user data and disseminate false information. We've really been seeing these take off this year, and we'll talk in our media literacy toolkit a little bit how to identify these. And then we have misleading social media content, and on this, I think a little bit about how things are strategically miscaptioned, maybe photos, or they're taken out of context to fit a particular agenda or narrative. Think videos from years ago that are posted under the pretense that they had just happened, or doctored images of real events. We're just, continuing to see this manipulated content being used to sow discord, confuse people, and, ultimately suppress voting. So then we also have troll farms and these coordinated efforts, coordinated and authentic behavior, and these are networks of fake profiles that amplify each other as a kind of collaborative system, and they often come in the forms of bots that are interacting with real people. And then, of course, clickbait that thrives and takes advantage of our emotional reactions and curiosities. And we're also seeing polarized or very heavily biased news sites that feign nonpartisanship, but are actually, again, moving towards a very concrete agenda. But it's also important to remember that disinformation is not a new phenomenon. Humans have been using this throughout all of history, as you can see here, and it's historically been used to manipulate public opinion. So, before the newspaper business was really had really established ethics of accuracy and professional standards, American publications were rife with lies and exaggeration. So, here are just a few other examples. But I just kind of want to stress that this is, a lot of times we hear Russian disinformation campaigns. This is not a new thing. These are strategies that have worked in the past, and we are now using our media literacy skills today and onward to combat this spread and continue to consume information responsibly. So on this next slide, we're going to take a look at how disinformation campaigns, a specific example here has really worked online. This specific example is kind of shows how the path goes from disinformation being spread that becomes misinformation. So back in July of 2016, this WTOEnews.com, a news hoax website, published a headline saying that the Pope had endorsed Trump, a quote that had been manipulated from a comment that the Pope had made about the probable inability of the FBI to prosecute Hillary Clinton over her emails. What this life cycle of this specific example of disinformation on this slide shows is that, it starts with a kernel of truth, which is then spun and distorted. And we'll talk a little bit about that psychological part of disinformation and why we're susceptible to it in a minute. But then you see that the Pope did comment about the principles in the 2016 election, but that information was manipulated to create this false narrative that the Pope endorsed Trump. The original agent who created this message remains unknown, but the impact was huge. After the message was produced, it was broadly reproduced by other agents who encountered the story on social media. So imagine yourself, or maybe you did encounter this on social media and you shared it. You were probably sharing it as misinformation, and which really just shows that misinformation and disinformation can just flow accidentally, but that's why we really have to zero in on these skills. And just for a better sense of the real scale of this, according to BuzzFeed, it was actually the most widely shared election story on Facebook, with almost 1 million engagements where people liked, commented, or shared it. So this is a good time to really reflect on our ability to be publishers here and online. We are all publishers when we share content to some degree. So when we repost it or whatever. So therefore, we really need to take on this responsibility to think about what we share and be conscious of assessing what is likely to be true and what is not. So before we really get into the prescriptive media literacy skills and toolkit, I think it's helpful to understand why we are actually so susceptible to disinformation. And there are actually a number of factors at play. And again, this is a non-exhaustive list, but I think it helps to understand the psychology of this. Okay, so these are kind of the components that come together here. Emotions, of course. Our emotions can easily be manipulated, especially when we consume something that makes us feel fear or anger. Think of when you're seeing headlines that are possibly written in all capital letters or exclamation points. These are good things to keep in mind when you're looking out for something that might be playing on your emotions, really suggesting a sense of urgency or playing on your innate fears. And then there's a patina of credibility. So in other words, a post or a tweet or a meme might kind of look real with names of fake organizations that maybe appear familiar. They might use real people's names that are slightly misspelled, references to people and events that are actually credible news. This is, again, kind of the idea of a kernel of truth, where our brains like to operate on kind of the easiest way. So if we know that part of it is true, we're more inclined to think that the rest of it is. And then of course bots, which we talked about earlier. Bots and troll farms are really operating heavily and to use this computer generated and designed to appear to users on social media as real accounts, especially on Twitter. And they're just popping up so quickly that we really need to be more on the lookout for it, as opposed to relying on these platforms to be as quick as they can to shut them down. And of course, we want to put that pressure on, but just in reality, these bots pop up all the time. And then we have the illusory truth effect, which essentially refers to this phenomenon of like, the more we encounter something, the more we believe it. There are a lot of studies done on this. It's been studied for many years, but I'm not going to get into it too much right now, but we have been seeing that, Facebook has been doing a couple studies where participants are shown a true or fake, a bunch of headlines. Some are true, some are fake, and then they're asked to evaluate them for truth. And then they're distracted. They come back to the same headlines. And they're more likely to consider the fake headlines true just because they'd seen them before. And so, as we continue to increase our awareness of these psychological effects of disinformation or ways that we're susceptible to it, it's good to remember that that is a very real phenomenon. And then, of course, confirmation bias, which refers to our very human tendency to seek out sources of information from sources which support our own beliefs. So now, I mentioned a little bit earlier about how, platforms like Twitter and Facebook are doing, they've tried some various methods for calling out false information or taking down bots. But there are a couple issues with these efforts. So for one, even Facebook disclaimers like the one that you're seeing on the screen here, they may not trigger the amount of skepticism needed for people to doubt that the story is false. And then the other thing is that we really don't want to, it's kind of walking this fine line. We don't want to be giving posts that are spreading false content. We don't want to give them much more oxygen, because every bit of engagement, every like, share, that continues to give it oxygen and continue to spread even further. So we'll talk a little bit about what to do if you see false information. Maybe somebody's spreading it, but there are ways to, message somebody privately so that you don't continue that spread. That said, I don't want to completely discredit the calling these out. Of course, we need to continue to call out these posts that are spreading disinformation. We are seeing that it works to some extent. So in 2018, there was a Gallup survey found that more than 60% of U.S. adults said that they were actually less likely to share stories from sites that were labeled as unreliable. And in 2019, a study conducted by the University of California found that labels are effective, at least in some capacity. So when users get a flag that information might be false, this notification can have an effect, of course, on reducing false news. But we can't rely on the flag alone. And much of this really does rest in our hands to take control of our news feeds and more carefully think about our digital experience, what we're consuming, have that consciousness on our minds always, so that when we do publish things and become publishers in our own right, we decide what we read and what we share appropriately. And with that, I think I'm going to hand it back over to Nora.
Thanks so much, Hannah. Well, part of what we were thinking about with this training today was if we're going to try to help first-time and young voters identify misleading information, whether it's news articles, maybe it's social media posts, maybe it's images or videos. We felt like it was also just going to be necessary to talk about what we anticipate this election season, what we're already seeing, and what early young voters are thinking about. And so the backdrop to how to combat disinformation, part of that, in addition to the psychological elements that Hannah laid out, are also just understanding what are those real examples. I think it can feel like such an abstract concept when we hear terms like foreign interference or deep fake videos. And you might be sitting there being like, well, this sounds compelling, but what does that actually really mean? And so part of what we've been doing over the last year is tracking what we sometimes refer to, at least internally, as the disinformation age, because it seems like every day there is some kind of new phenomenon, this way that disinformation percolates and infiltrates our lives. Back in January, the World Health Organization mentioned that we were up against an international infodemic in which fake and misleading information about the pandemic was riddling and really kind of just infiltrating our news feeds in ways that sowed not only discord, but it created inconsistencies where citizens didn't exactly even know what to believe, how to turn to which types of news sources for credible information. We've then seen, in the wake of George Floyd's killing in May, we have seen this surge in protests, in civil unrest, in frankly the longest and most sustained solidarity movement in the United States, with some cities having protests every single day nonstop since June. Since May 30th. And in the middle of that, we have seen efforts to discredit the movement, to discredit community organizing and protests, to create violent narratives, both online and offline. And then, of course, we are readying ourselves for what we anticipate will happen now and in the lead up to November 3rd. And so, part of what I want to be able to give you guys is this accurate picture of what we will be up against. And a lot of that requires an understanding of what these first-time voters, what we think of as the emerging electorate, make sense of all of this content that they are receiving. So I want to just talk a little bit about what the emerging electorate looks like. And our friends at the Knight Foundation actually just released a new study that looks at what young college voters are thinking about this election season. What's really interesting is that the backdrop that I just mentioned has really inspired a kind of about face for a lot of how we're thinking of the apathy or lack of interest in civic engagement that we had seen. So earlier this year, the Knight Foundation actually released a big landmark study. It surveyed 12,000 what they call persistent non-voters to really understand what were the underlying challenges of electoral participation. And they found that with emerging electorate groups, those are the 18 to 24-year-olds who are eligible citizens to vote. Many of them were actually already registered or had even voted before, and yet they were far less interested in voting this election cycle in 2020, even more so than other categories of what they called chronic non-voters. So there was something happening where 18 to 24-year-olds were not interested in voting and seemed even less interested than other groups that weren't interested in voting. And then what's really fascinating is that Knight redid this study, tried to re-examine what the emerging electorate felt and how they were thinking about the election. And so they just released last month it's called the 1 Million Project. And part of what they researched this second time around was what was the effect of COVID? What was the effect of various protests and civil unrest around the country? And what they found actually is that 71% of students said they are absolutely certain now that they will vote in the 2020 election. That is an incredible change where these other formerly chronic non-voters not interested in civic participation suddenly now in majority numbers are saying that they want to vote and that they absolutely will vote this November. What's really interesting, though, is that we've also seen some other findings. One of them is that students are likely to doubt the results of the presidential election, which makes the kinds of discussions we have about how disinformation can create questions or doubt or allow somehow those seeds in our own minds, of discrediting institutions to really take hold. According to what Knight found in their most recent revised study, is that half of students have said that problems at polling places would lead them to have major doubts about the fairness of the election. So that could be maybe long lines, it could be broken voting machines, and that the potential presence of that type of delay could actually prevent or lead them to feel like, is this a corrupt process? And so this is also part of why in tonight's training, we want to be able to walk you all through why understanding and knowing where to turn to make sense of credible information about the electoral process is so critical. Because delays, I hate to break it to you, they're going to happen. We are absolutely going to have delays this election season. We are going to have delays in our ability to vote, how long it will take, how long results will come in. And we do not want those anticipated delays to be the reason that somehow young emerging electorates feel like there is no confidence that they can place in our process. And then finally, part of what we also found from our colleagues at the Knight Foundation was that students lack confidence just generally in the legitimacy of the election. What they found was that about half feel that the election itself won't be fair and open. A majority feel like it will not be administered well. Again, these are the types of findings that make us at PEN America feel like it is all the more urgent to help give you the tools to identify disinformation and to really understand how your voice matters. So some of the energy, frankly, I think, around what's been able to contribute to the about face that we have seen and this renewed, I would say, a resurgence of interest in the electoral process is actually thanks to our wonderful colleagues, and part of why we were so excited to partner with groups like the New Georgia Project, like Voto Latino. So I can't list everything they are doing because they're doing such great stuff, but I wanted to give you just a couple of really fun examples of how they are doing and thinking about innovative programs to engage young voters. One is the New Georgia Project has created an interactive live stream with Twitch, and they have a hashtag for it called Twitch the Vote. It's really intended to engage voters, mostly young voters, mostly Black and other voters of color. It's in collaboration with Michelle Obama's When We All Vote and the esports platform eSposure. And so what they've been doing is on National Black Voter Registration Day and on National Voter Registration Day, they engaged Twitch and this live stream to try to get people interested in what the electoral process means, what this election cycle is going to look like. It's really a really fun and exciting use of a new platform, trying to almost enhance the sportsman-like, the gaming aspects of the voting process. Another really fun example is this Friday. And so I can't describe too much yet, but Voto Latino is going to be hosting a virtual Power Summit. And they'll be bringing together celebrities, influencers, politicians, community organizers, and disinformation experts to talk about what the power of voting and democracy is, and really the necessary ways that Latino voters and communities will play in this election season. So we're really excited about that. If you're interested, when we follow up at the end of tonight, we'll send you information about their Power Summit as well. So here's the question. I think this is honestly like the big question some of you will probably have, which is, what are you actually seeing on the ground? What are the examples of misinformation and disinformation that might lead to or influence voter suppression, that might contribute to the apathy or sense of uselessness for first-time voters? So we're giving you two big categories. I want to talk about mail-in ballots, and then I want to talk about how more vulnerable voting blocks are being targeted with disinformation tactics. That includes Black and Latino voters. Though I think that we are beginning to see other campaign tactics targeting Indigenous, Asian, and other people of color. And it's really important to talk about those things and elevate how these communities are being targeted. So first, I want to mention a story that our colleagues at First Draft have found, claims that ballots, mail-in ballots specifically, are color-coded to out voters and their party affiliation. These types of claims, frankly, have zero legitimacy, but they are very hard to debunk. And of course, I'll tell you why, but there are a few things that these claims have made. One, assertions that the colors, literally the printed colors on ballots, are a way to note for election officials and local county officials if someone is a Democrat, Republican, independent, otherwise, if it's their first time, that basically these misleading claims are trying to tell people that the election is somehow corrupt and that officials will be sorting and potentially not counting votes depending on the color of your ballot. Here's why it's really hard to debunk that. Every local election county official has a different process for how they count and tabulate their votes. And often the colors associated with a specific county correlate to how they count votes. Whether someone is mailing in their ballot, otherwise, if there are provisional ballots, colors mean different things across communities. And for election officials, there are not consistencies between somewhere in Michigan over here in Lansing and then the color coding in Detroit. And so it's incredibly hard if you are one of the members of a private Facebook group to see this claim or a claim similar to this. It's really hard to actually fact check this. One of the only ways is to try to turn to credible websites. The National Association of Secretaries of State, Election Protection, Vote.org. There are a few of them that we will be sharing after this workshop because we want you to understand that feeling when you suddenly are stressed or emotional, kind of what Hannah talked about, that disinformation will play on and thrive on your emotions. And often the misleading claims on social media that we see are really hard actually to pinpoint, well, is that hard stop disinformation? Or is it the type of thing that, yes, it's correct that mail-in ballots do have different colors, but no, it's really hard then to find out what they actually mean across the entire country. Another example around mail-in ballots is this image I have shared, we put here on the screen, claims that the system itself is corrupt and that ballots are being thrown out. And so our colleagues from the News Literacy Project recently shared this image. It was from Elijah Schaefer, I'm so sorry, posting that these mail-in ballots were found in a dumpster in California. They were discovered in a certain area in a landfill. And I think it's important to kind of walk through actually what the reality is. I want to kind of fact check this for you. So no, the envelopes in these photos here do not contain ballots. Yes, they are empty envelopes that once contained mail-in ballots, but those ballot envelopes in these photos are actually from the 2018 midterm election. Under state law in California, those envelopes, not the actual ballots, the envelopes that had the ballots, they are required in California under state law to hold those envelopes for a period of time. It has now been almost 22 months. And so they were held for that long. And so when they were then discovered in a landfill, yes, they were discovered in a landfill, but they do not actually contain ballots and they are not from the 2020 election. The process of going through all of that fact checking takes time. What we always say is truth takes time. So if you see images, videos, headlines that get your heart racing, think about why your heart is racing. And we will get into, Hannah's going to walk us through what our tips are in how to question what you're seeing and ways to actually fact check or verify things like this. But I just want to kind of flag ahead of time that it takes time. So I think it's important here, as just two minor examples, that there are a number of ways that we might see hard stop disinformation. We might then see people sharing images or videos like Elijah here, when his post was retweeted 500 times, and I'm sure after this image was grabbed, it was shared even more. So if you're seeing things and you're actually believing them, right, you might be susceptible to not just hard stop disinformation, but stuff like this, where there is actually a kernel of truth. There is that patina of credibility where these look real. They look real because they're real. They are actually envelopes that contained mail-in ballots. But going through the homework and the research will take time if you want to be someone that does not fall prey to or become a victim of disinformation. And frankly, if you get good enough, part of what we hope in our trainings is that you then become an amplifier of credible content, that you take some of the resources you have learned tonight, you take some of our tip sheets, the resources that we'll be sharing from our colleagues at various other organizations, and that you flood the zone. You know, share it on your Facebook, share it on your Twitter. If people are going to whatever they're seeing from their trusted friends and family, you might be the reason that someone actually will pause and fact check something. And so it's really important to just understand how much work that actually will take. I also want to talk a little bit about more vulnerable groups that we know have been targeted with disinformation campaigns. And, you know, some of that is educative. In the 2016 election cycle, Black voters were targeted more aggressively than any other segment of the voting population. In new stories that have emerged just yesterday, we have found that there were disinformation campaigns to deter voters from turning out, to basically depress Black voters, and Black voters were labeled as deterrents in these various categories where their names, their information, they were lumped together, and that those types of voters, Black voters, had to somehow be given messaging that would dissuade them from believing in the electoral process and the legitimacy of our election. Now in 2020, we are still seeing Black voters being targeted, as we are seeing Latino voters and Spanish speakers. One of the more common ones is something that Spanish language voters, these claims say, cannot bring a translator into the ballot box. This is actually, I think, a much easier example to debunk because it's just wrong. And there isn't a whole long research project you have to go down or a rabbit hole to discover that that is inaccurate. But it's always one that we call out. The other types of claims, though, that we are seeing now are things that are actually not hard stop disinformation, but misleading narratives that are pushing people to the boundaries, to the sort of further limits of our political parties. The notion, for example, that protesters are somehow working with radical and violent aggressors, and that the Democratic Party supports that. And so we've heard stories that in places with high Latino voter concentration, like in Florida, radio hosts and other messaging is conveyed to Latino voters about these more radical stories that are not necessarily all completely false or created false as disinformation, but they're narratives that really are that aspect of things that Hannah laid out, the hyper-partisan, the kind of biased news coverage that masquerades as credible and nonpartisan and centrist. And so when that is conveyed to people and they are sort of encouraged and pushed to believe in these things, it helps contribute to voter practices, to maybe even the notion that something might not be worth voting. There are any number of ways. And so part of our role throughout all of this is to think about, well, how can we give you the tools to make sense of that? And frankly, I don't want you to feel like it's all bad. But before you get excited about all of the solutions, this is one of, I would say, the most critical slides of the presentation tonight. we've done a very deep dive with other experts on what we can expect this election season. The idea is we know that voters will be targeted with disinformation. The pandemic will lead some people to vote by mail, whether it is because they want to avoid lines, maybe it is for health reasons, it might be young or first-time voters who are at their university or college. We will then see potentially any number of things, and the delays that we anticipate will be for a number of reasons. And so I want to walk you through these, because we've really thought through what 5 major buckets of expectation setting you should have in your mind. These are the things to talk about with your friends, to talk about with your family. These are the things that we know we can anticipate. So one is, we know to expect voting to require more time and more thought than usual. If you are not registered, you may want to go to the National Association of Secretaries of State. They have a page called Can I Vote? We will be sending that after the training. Go there to confirm your own registration status. You can also check your state's deadlines, procedures, and think about what your plan is, your voter plan. If you want to mail in your ballot, for example, there are recommendations that you mail it in by a certain time. Frankly, even the US Postal Service has recommended that you need to give your mail-in ballot 2 weeks to reach your local county officials in snail mail. So what that means is we're already at the end of September, we're almost in October. If something will take 2 weeks and you want to get your mail-in ballot at least to your local officials by November 3rd, you need to then make sure that you are sending it at the latest by October 24th, 20th, in there. And frankly, every state will have different regulations. I don't want you to feel like if Nora said, I have to mail it in by October 20th, that's the date. You want to do your homework. You want to make sure that you know everything. And frankly, it's going to take time. So if you want to then think about doing early voting in person, that will require some different changes. If you think you want to vote in person on election day, all of these are possible options that are totally fine. Just think ahead. Think ahead about what you will require given how different this year is, that we are amid a pandemic and that we are going to see much more chaos and I think confusion. The second thing is, we're all guilty of spreading misinformation. And hopefully after tonight, you'll be a little more on guard. But part of what we want to be able to do is give you a sense that you shouldn't just be fact-checking news websites. You shouldn't just fact-check Fox News or New York Times or some other website that someone shares. You want to fact-check everything, even the people you trust. And so part of that means the influencers in your life, your parents, your friends that maybe say they know a lot because they have voted before. These are the things that we honestly are cautioning everyone about and saying it's going to be a really ripe period from right before the November election through November, the entire month. It'll really be ripe for misinformation to thrive. Maybe people will be sharing things because frankly they feel like they're helping. Either way, whatever people are sharing, whether it is a video of them waiting at a polling location, maybe it is election results, you need to fact check that. And then we want you to be prepared for how the media will be reporting on results. And this is something we're going to be doing a lot of programming around. So if you are interested, stay tuned for more from Penn. We're going to be doing a series of events. Today was the kickoff of our partnership with the Washington Post, for example, on why voting matters. We're going to be doing a session on disinformation with the Washington Post. We're working with the Associated Press on understanding with various standards and decision desk editors how they're going to be reporting on results. What is the AP's role in all of this? And so we encourage you to try to figure that out, do some of your own homework, but also know where to turn. And so we're going to be releasing a very short election guide around all of these issues, including how the AP calls results and the way that they are considered kind of the gold standard in a results calling. We also then want you to be prepared to expect and accept delays. A lot of that is because of mail-in ballots, and that we are going to see a rise in mail-in ballots, and given that, it will take time for election officials to count them. So the delay itself, if we are waiting and we do not have election results for some of the races, whether they are the presidential or other local and state races, if we don't have those on election night, that does not necessarily mean that the entire system is rigged or corrupt. It's really actually probably that election officials are doing their job. And so we are anticipating that election day and election night will actually become election week, maybe election month. And so it's a period in which disinformation will be used to cast doubt on the credibility of our process. So, what do? Honestly, I think that we need to be patient and we need to try to be calm. And in that period, if we are encouraged or somehow wanting to share things or believe things, go back to number 2. Fact check everything you see, even from the people you trust, and wait and understand what the media's reporting will look like and how election officials do their job. And then honestly, the final thing is, I try not to be too ironic or funny about it, but expect the unexpected. If there are delays, we want people to understand that that will probably mean that people are doing their job and votes are being counted. But there may also be legitimate reasons that organizers, community advocates, voting rights experts might actually see instances of very troubling mismanagement of the electoral process. And so we don't even know what those unexpected things might be, but all of this, it's a great start. I think the stuff that we offer is truly fantastic, but you still need to be on guard and prepared for whatever else might be thrown your way. And so in thinking about how you will be prepared, I want to be able to turn it back over to Hannah, because I think the question now is just really, what can we do? And how can we empower ourselves to make sense of what we are seeing? So Hannah, will you take it away and empower everyone with our media literacy toolkit?
Yes, challenge accepted. Okay, so yes, as Nora said, we want to, now that you have this information, now that you have in your mind that there could be some unexpected things, including things popping up in your news feed that doesn't quite look right to you, we want to equip you with our media literacy toolkit. And our goal here is not to be reactive when we encounter information online, but instead really channel and be skeptical consumers. So healthy skeptics all the way. Let's go through some of these resources, some of these steps, which are readily available to us to build our toolkit for healthy news consumption as we approach Election Day and all the information that will be thrown our way along with it. So the first step, and an important one, is to take control of your digital experience by conducting a scan of how and where you consume your information, which means we really need to be able to recognize and train our emotional reactions to develop this vital skepticism. So just in the same way that we take measures to protect our health against infection and viruses, an important first step is to inoculate ourselves to protect against the harmful side of our digital lives. So just remember that you are empowered to have that healthy skepticism. Step 2 is take a step back. So question your reactions to things that you see online. Like we were talking about earlier, there are many things that are many headlines and strategies that bad actors and disinformation campaigns will employ to poke our emotions. So they thrive on our emotional engagements, the likes and shares, as I mentioned earlier, on social media platforms. And there's a lot of intentionality behind the way that headlines are written that are designed to encourage you to disseminate those posts, even if they're false or misleading. So don't take the bait. Then we want to encourage you to go further and understand what you're seeing. This might seem obvious to, try and distinguish between news and opinion, but I like to reiterate and stress here that these disinformation campaigns and bad actors, they know what they're doing. So they know that we can all fall prey to this. So we want to remember to really just question, even if you think you know what you're looking at, look at about pages, look at labels. Most credible news sources go out of their way to label something as opinion or breaking news. So just be aware of that before hitting share or forward. Consider what type of content you are sharing. And a big part of this is being able to kind of parse through various types of content and have the skill to evaluate different types of media. And so step 4 is, do your research. Check the credibility of the source. Check, it might sound like credible news sites, but there are countless examples of, what we were talking about earlier with pink slime websites, bad actors that are creating these fake outlets, intentionally making them look real and sound real. So check the source of the story, see if it's a credible source before passing it along to others. And then we encourage a very heavy fact-checking routine. I think we can go to the next one. Oh, I'm sorry. Before that, we do want to encourage you to familiarize yourself with the hallmarks of credible journalism. So back to the fake news websites, these are not going to be reflective of these ethics, these quality control, and these standards. So familiarize yourself with what accuracy looks like. Fact check, challenge the quoted sources and identify them. I won't go through all of these, but just it's a good thing to keep in mind as you go about your day. What does quality journalism, what does quality reporting look like, and how do I recognize it? Okay. And then step 5, verify before you share. As Nora mentioned, in we're going to send a follow-up email, and you'll receive a long list of very great, credible fact-checking resources. There's, in addition to that, something that we like to empower participants of these workshops with is, you don't have to go through a ton of hoops to run a simple fact check yourself. Often we just encourage if you see something that seems a little fishy and you aren't sure how true it is, go ahead and just plug it into Google verbatim and use, pair it with one of these words that's on the screen, false or fake or hoax. If it has been proven inaccurate or false, you'll see it pop up that way. This is a really easy way to check. And then also, of course, refer to some of these great fact-checking websites that we'll discuss. Another fun kind of what we call an extra credit step is to familiarize yourself with reverse image searches. I have RevEye as a Chrome extension on my Google Chrome app or whatever. And so it's really, really easy. I'm a huge proponent of it. All you have to do is right click once you have it installed, and it's kind of like a Google search of an image. So, back in June, during the Black Lives Matter protests, we saw a lot of doctored photos of protesters with signs that they were holding that had different words than what was actually there in reality. So, something that was really helpful was you can right click on that image and see a bunch of different iterations of the same image that had been manipulated. So again, that's RevEye, reverse image search, and we'll be sending a lot of these resources in the follow-up email. And of course, be sure to verify or be sure to check the year and the place, as I mentioned. Another common strategy is miscaptioning or taking out of context videos or images to fit a certain narrative. And yes, again, I think we saw a lot of this this summer. There were, there's ways to really get into the minutia of certain accounts. So here with Rashida Tlaib, it's like it comes down to the like capitalization of the I and the L here. So like if you want to verify an account, know that there can be very small details that can clue you in and give way to showing you that an account is fake or has been manipulated. And of course, do your part and flag it for Google if you can, so that you can stop the spread. And then of course, watch out for accounts that are recently joined or with low engagements. Those can be other telling signs. And then this is the list of great fact-checking resources, credible fact-checking resources that have been vetted. And we will include this in our list of resources in our follow-up email. And it's good to, in the same way that we diversify our news consumption, it's also really a healthy practice to diversify your fact-checking resources. These different fact-checking websites have different ways of kind of noting how credible or inaccurate a story is. And so it'll be good to, familiarize yourself with the methods that they're using. And again, empower yourself to use these as tools and not as, a end all be all. And this Pinocchio is an example of the different types of levels or ways that fact-checking resources can kind of denote to their readership how credible or incredible something is. But, if Pinocchios don't speak to you, you can try another type of fact-checking resource. And I believe with that, I will turn it back over to Nora.
That was great. I didn't know that you actually have RevEye, Hannah, on your computer. That's so cool. I'm very impressed. I don't even have it on mine. I just do the old-fashioned searching, so it's hysterical. So let's see. We want to leave a little bit of time for questions. I know that we've gotten a couple of them in the Q&A function. We generally use the chat function if you want to say hi to each other, tell each other where you're from, share your own resources. And then the Q&A is really for the questions around things that you want to discuss with us or things that we might not have covered enough. But I do think it's good for us to talk through what you can do. And I guess the list could be exhaustive, right? But let's just start with the top 4 things. I think one is learn about the threat of disinformation. And you're here, so that means that dozens of you now have been able to understand some of these threats. I also think that identifying trusted voices in your community will be great. Not to necessarily always take what they mean as the truth, necessarily whole stop, but to identify those people, whether it's local journalists, maybe on your Twitter feed, you want to spend some time curating and thinking about who those people are. Is it a radio host? Is it some other influencer? Is there someone that you feel really confident in, that you're able to turn to and fact check them and feel confident about those fact checking experiences and findings? And then number 3, frankly, in my opinion, is one of the most important, is be a resource for others. Share information, question people. Think about it carefully, though. And so actually, the number 1 question we get at PEN America in our sessions is, what do I do if I see a friend, see a family member that has shared misinformation? And so what we always encourage people to do is to check out our tip sheets as one of the resources to allow them to understand different aspects of disinformation. We have a few, and I'm going to just sort of walk you through them. One is we have a tip sheet, obviously, on how to talk to friends and family, but we also then have discrete topics like COVID disinformation, like protest disinformation and how to verify images and videos. A little bit of the teaser that Hannah gave you. If you want more details about those will be included in the tip sheets and the kind of resources we send afterwards. But we're not the only organization that provides these resources, and we don't set out to be. Frankly, we have been working with coalitions of other experts, voting experts, disinformation experts, and we want to loop you into that network. We want to be able to make sure that you know where to turn. So sometimes it's us, other times election protection is the go-to resource. We want you to feel like you know what those different websites are and who those trusted voices are. Because on election day, we want you to know what to expect. We want you to feel like if there are claims online on your feeds, you'll know what to do to question what you see, to think carefully. And so we encourage you then really to just, be in touch with us. And if there are questions in your experience that you have, let us know. Here's just a teaser, a little taste of what our recommendations are around how to talk to friends and family who share misinformation. And I want to make sure that we leave enough time for at least 15 minutes of questions. So I really just sort of pose this to you as a teaser to get you started and to get you interested in what's to come when we send that email. And so finally, I want to just say, stay in touch with us, whether it's following us on Twitter. Make sure that you, tell us those stories of whatever they are. And then when you end this workshop, we are automatically going to be prompting that you fill out a very short post-workshop survey. Part of what we're hoping is, those are private results, but they help us and inform what we're doing with our workshops and how we're thinking about our curriculum. So we've heard a lot about the need for targeted trainings for first-time voters, for Black and Latino and other BIPOC voters. And we've been trying to diversify all of the different programs we offer because of what we hear from you. So we really do use what you say to build out our programming. And so I hope that you'll take just a little bit of time. It would probably only be about 2 minutes to fill out the survey. And then finally, we want you to stay tuned for resources. Not only the resources that we'll send after this workshop, but the ones that you may see and find useful in the lead up to the election. We're going to be doing a whole series of campaigns. On Instagram, we'll be rolling out a series of interviews with experts and influencers. We have an interactive quiz to test your media literacy skills that's launching tomorrow. We have ongoing conversations around battleground states, for example, with journalists, with community organizers, with attorneys, basically trying to prepare everyone for what is coming this November. And so with that, I'm going to open it up for questions, and we just are so thrilled to have had you all, and thank you. We look forward to being in touch with you. So let's see the questions. Hannah, I'm going to read these out, and I'll take a stab, and you can take a stab as well if you want. Let's see. Question. How do you fight election disinformation when it is the president who is sending these false informations out to the public? Excellent question. We get this question a lot, not just about election disinformation, but about a range of ways that people ask, what do we do when leaders are the vectors of disinformation, when they are the peddlers and the purveyors? And it's a question that I think I don't have a perfect answer to. So much of what we think the answer is these types of sessions and the types of tools and skills to make sense of what others are saying. But, I mentioned just in passing the tip sheet that we put out on how to talk to friends and family who share misinformation. Part of why we did that is because when we get questions around that, the issue at the end of the day is about how do we change the hearts and minds of others? How do we really work with people and have discourse or dialogue? And it's really hard. I think sometimes we can influence people. We can give them tools to verify different websites. We can make people think carefully about captions on images and videos, but we're not going to change everyone. We're not going to make everyone believe what credible health news looks like or information about public health and science. If we have leaders that are promoting misleading content and misleading narratives, it really comes down to how do we then try to make sense of coming together in conversations around what is the shared belief that we all agree on. And that is incredibly hard. You'll see my dog in the background. She's clearly ready to sit down. She's like, I'm done. You know, I think that it is not a perfect answer. But these sessions, and frankly, proliferating, trying to reach as many people as we can to think carefully about information, whether it is from our friends or our president, those are really critical skills. And you don't get really good at it immediately. I want to just kind of mention, because I think sometimes the feeling is, you know, these trainings, it's just an introduction to these skills. It's just an introduction to the concepts of media literacy, of how content can be misleading and why it manipulates us. So I hope that that at least was some of an answer. If we had a perfect answer, I don't know if we would even have a program like this, because what we are trying to do is our part in tackling those problems and the ways that we are unable to come together, where we just simply have broken down our trust in each other and in our systems. I'm looking at an interesting question. Are gaming metaphors wise? We already have people who think politics is a game of us versus them and are not sufficiently concerned with the real consequences of voting decisions. I believe that this would be in response to the ways that the esports efforts and Twitch, the vote, were using gaming metaphors. You know, I have not led those efforts, so I want to first give that caveat, but I think that, you know, part of what my partners have said at other organizations, and that organizations leading these types of efforts say, is that we have to use the culture of what different communities gravitate to. That there are cultures of apathy, but then there can be ways that we encourage new cultures and to see similarities. So if an 18-year-old is suddenly interested in the electoral process because of a gaming metaphor, I would say that that's a win at the end of the day. If there are ways that we can get people to care about democracy, I don't really think that it's an us versus them. That these types of gaming metaphors are different. This is trying to gamify by making fun the process of registering and thinking about what your role is as a player in a way. And then another question is, how would you suggest dealing with debunking memes? These are especially powerful with younger people. Totally agree. Gosh, you know, this is where I had to bring Hannah in. She's even the tiniest bit younger, I think, and hipper. And I was like, I don't know how we're going to talk to young people. That being said, I think that there are some really cool experts talking about how to debunk memes. One of them is through Jamie Cohen's group, and they have been doing a lot around meme culture. So that's one thing I would check out. Another that I would check out is all of the organizations that are trying to use memes to debunk misleading content that is represented or conveyed in memes and other visual content. Visual misinformation and disinformation, I think, whether it is memes or otherwise, is honestly, I think, the hardest to really parse through. Do you remember the video and the images of mail-in ballots in a pile? I honestly was so moved. That was such an evocative image. When then you pair it with some clever meme-like thing, it's really powerful. And so that's part of why, you know, we want to begin trying to spend more and more time in our programming giving you tools for just images and videos. What happens when you see something that's a video and your friend shared it? Maybe Hannah shared it. And Hannah's sharing this because we're friends, and she thinks she's done some really wonderful job of giving me and her other friends information. And the speed that an image or a video can convey things, especially memes, are faster than an entire headline or an article. And so the skills needed to unpack and slow down are frankly no different. It's just that it happens so much faster when you see an image of something that you will naturally believe it and somehow feel like that must be real, because it's harder to manipulate perhaps in our own minds. The time it takes to read a whole article, that's longer. And so memes can convey things, facts, beliefs, otherwise, so fast. And that's part of why some of the really interesting experts doing work on this now are talking about that moment, the moment of slowing down. When you want to share something, the moment that Hannah talked about of feeling emotional, like, whoa, take a step back, question what you're seeing and why you're feeling the way you are. Hannah, what do you think?
Yeah, I was just gonna chime in real quick, kind of a little bit about what Nora was saying with meeting people where they are with like this gamifying concept as well. I think some of our partners at MediaWise are doing something really interesting with young people. Kate, you specifically mentioned younger people here. And they are collaborating with this meme account on Instagram called Kale Salad. And what they are doing is they are integrating kind of awareness of misinformation and fact checking into this meme account, so that when teenagers are scrolling through Instagram and they have already been following Kale Salad, they will now be, that's the handle, at Kale Salad, they will be also encountering some media literacy lessons here. So I think it is really important to meet people where they are and use what they are already familiar with to get into their heads about these kinds of things.
Let me see if there are other questions. We have a few more minutes. This is another question that actually we get a lot. Can you always count on Snopes or factcheck.org for fast checking needs? You know, the pessimist in me wants to say you can never really count on everything all the time. I really think Hannah was right when she said you have to diversify your fact-checking resources the way you diversify your news consumption and sources. Snopes is the longest running fact-checking website. They were founded in 1994. And I think it's important they do really good work. They have been around for so long, and you know, if you're needing fast checking information or corrections, not all of these fact checking websites will provide that. That's part of why it can take time to do the research to confirm and verify information. Some of our colleagues in Denver, for example, that we've worked with, have talked about how it could take 2 hours to fact check something when it isn't on any other fact checking website. And so I would just sort of note that it isn't just necessarily Snopes or factcheck.org, but you may not come up with anything. The good news is that fact-checking resources they're going in overdrive right now in the lead up to the election to actually have more fact-checking resources. And social media platforms are also trying to provide those types of resources with their election information centers. So if you are inclined to try to just test out fact-checking websites, you should begin looking at all of them. I have to say my personal favorite is PolitiFact. They're an arm of the Poynter Institute, as is MediaWise, for example, regarding Kale Salad. But frankly, you should be checking all of them out and diversifying, seeing which ones you like. Sometimes a story that hasn't been fact-checked on one may actually be on another. Another one is to follow certain reporters on Twitter that are doing a really careful, thoughtful, measured job of reporting about certain things. These are reporters like Jane Litvinenko at BuzzFeed, Brandy Zadrozny at NBC News, Craig Silverman at BuzzFeed as well. They're doing really careful, thoughtful coverage, and they are not fact-checking websites. So again, fact check what you see, try to just not take automatically what others are saying, but those can be really credible journalists as well. Let's see. Another question is, would you elaborate on how minorities are being targeted? What are the emotional triggers they are trying to set off? Hannah, I want to make sure you jump in as well. I know we're coming up on time, but I'll say a little bit. We have been studying and looking at this for a while. I think that different minorities are targeted with different messaging. Latino voters, for example, have leanings that run conservative. Hispanic voters in Florida that might be more Republican leaning or centrist. And so the campaign messaging to somehow move them further right looks different than what is given and targeting Black voters. So it's important here when we're thinking about just how are minorities targeted, like, well, they're targeted in really different ways. Latinos in Florida, there is a lot right now that we are seeing from our partners in which the narrative of the Democratic Party is that it is a radical, socialist, communist, far left-leaning organization and party that aligns itself with very left, radical, communist entities. These types of messages, as just one example, are meant to drive Latino voters further into, as I described, these sort of polarizing ends of the political system. But that's different than how Black voters are being targeted. And if you're interested in some of the ways that various minorities are targeted, we do have some resources that we can include. A lot of what happened in 2016 in the way that Black voters were targeted, basically to believe that their vote wouldn't count or that the system was not going to really be accountable to them. That's vastly different than the kinds of things that we are seeing targeting Latino voters. Have I missed any others, Hannah?
I think there are just a couple more in the Q&A.
I'm seeing a little more now. Let's see. Someone else has said, what are some news sources that you would consider unbiased, relatively well fact-checked for starters? News sources. Well, I think that depends on how you're getting your news. And one of my major recommendations would be to begin exploring the policies behind various news outlets, because that can help understand the bias, the potential political leanings, the funding, the policies behind the people and the practices of certain newsrooms. How do you do that? We actually have something called a newsroom transparency tracker. We launched this last year at PEN America. The notion being that transparent information about news outlets can build trust in communities. If we know what our newsroom's policies are, we might feel a little bit better about, well, we know how they're making their information and how they're packaging, how they're investigating, how they're correcting mistakes, how they're hiring diverse employees and journalists. It's a really great resource to just begin thinking about what news sources are credible and what kinds of policies underlie the work they do. So the Newsroom Transparency Tracker is a partnership between the Trust Project and PEN America. That's one place. And then I would also just say that, you're not going to get a surefire list anywhere of what news sources are unbiased, because there are numerous ways that bias can be part of news coverage. And frankly, there is, I hope Hannah will speak a little to it as well, is we've seen really interesting new efforts, some of this led by Black journalists in light of coverage around the George Floyd protests, that bias and objectivity should not always be the end game goal. That when there is this kind of holy grail of coverage that is simply unbiased, that seems to suggest that we then cannot question systems, that we cannot question the status quo when the status quo might be incredibly inequitable. And so the mere question itself of just what news sources, I would say, is a hard one to answer, because some of that also assumes that unbiased, that the lack of opinion is always going to be the right thing.
Yeah, and I'll just chime in. There's been a couple articles that have come out kind of in response to Alexis Johnson's story in Pittsburgh, and she, for those of you who aren't familiar, and I know it's 8 p.m. and we only have a few more seconds, but she was sidelined from reporting on the protest, the Black Lives Matter protests, and after the killing of George Floyd, for when she was reporting at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, because of a tweet that she had. It was meant to be. It was a tweet about a photo, and it was satirical about how the city gets trashed during Kenny Chesney concerts, and comparing it to how protesters had been called looters. So she was. This was on her personal Twitter. She was sidelined from reporting on this, and it really started a very interesting and important conversation about objectivity in local reporting, and how, and you know, I just read a very interesting article from Pointer, I believe, about how this is kind of a call to consider how we talk about objectivity when we talk about journalism, and where it actually does have a place at the table. And how we can consider to kind of reorganize our thoughts on that. Two other things. One, we hope you'll join us for a panel with local Rust Belt journalists tomorrow to specifically discuss local reporting and objectivity. And this will be mainly in reporters in Pennsylvania and Ohio. And then the other thing I was just going to mention is that there's also a very helpful newsletter called The Factual. And what they do is you receive it in your inbox every day, and they are very transparent about their grading system, but they do high-level stories that are in the news, and they will provide they'll try to provide a balance of right-leaning reporters or outlets with left-leaning, and then centrist, and they will tell you how they got to those scales of how they've rated them. And we can send that in our follow-up email as well. So plenty of resources to continue thinking about that objectivity and bias.
Thanks, Hannah. Well, you know, we are a little over time, but I just want to thank all of you for being here tonight. When we sign out, you'll be prompted to fill out our survey about this evening's workshop. We look forward then to keeping you involved, keeping you part of the PEN America family, and all of our upcoming events and resources and our quiz. I think, as you can tell, I'm very excited about our quiz. So we are so thrilled to have you, and thank you all so much. If you have comments, if you have stories, please share them. Share your questions about what your family is doing. Share your questions about what your friends are saying, other politicians, and we look forward to hearing more from you. So thanks so much.